What if the people who said they had no idea knew everything? Let that question sit with you for a moment. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a crime scene. It doesn't begin with sirens. It doesn't even begin with shock. It begins with silence. Years of it, carefully maintained, strategically justified, quietly defended behind closed doors. And now, that silence is cracking. Because for the first time, the people closest to the center of this story, Jake Reiner, Tracy Reiner, and Romy Reiner, are no longer staying quiet. And what they are now saying is shaking everything people thought they understood. We hid the truth for years. That single sentence is doing more damage than any accusation ever could. But what truth? Hidden from whom? And why now? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Those are the questions pulling millions of people into this story. And they are not going away. If you're watching this, chances are you already think you know what happened. You've seen the headlines. You've heard the names. You've read the summaries that make it all seem simple. But what if it wasn't simple at all? What if the real story lived in the spaces between public statements? In family conversations that never reached the outside world? In decisions made out of fear, loyalty, and denial? This is not a story about monsters. It's a story about people who believe they could manage something they didn't fully understand until it was too late. And the most unsettling part? They admit it. The Reiner name has long carried weight, respect, influence, stability. From the outside, it looked solid, unshakable, the kind of family people assume has it all figured out. But behind that image, according to those now speaking out, was something else entirely. Something volatile, something unpredictable, something everyone saw, but no one wanted to confront. Nick. For years, the narrative presented to the public was controlled, restrained, and carefully worded. Struggles were minimized. Conflicts were reframed. Warning signs were softened into misunderstandings. Why? Because families don't want to believe the worst about their own. Ask yourself this. If someone you loved showed signs that frightened you, would you immediately expose them? Or would you try to fix it quietly? Would you hope it passed? Would you convince yourself it wasn't serious? Would you protect the family name just a little longer? According to the voices now breaking their silence, that's exactly what happened. They say they noticed changes. Not all at once. Not dramatically at first. It started small. Mood shifts. Outbursts that felt out of character. Moments of intensity followed by remorse. At least, that's how it's described now. But hindsight has a way of sharpening memories, doesn't it? Things that once seemed manageable suddenly look like warnings. And the hardest part? Admitting that you saw those warnings and chose not to act. This is where the story stops being comfortable. Because this isn't about blaming from the outside. It's about responsibility from the inside. Jake Reiner, Tracy Reiner, and Romy Reiner are not speaking as outsiders looking in. They are speaking as people who were there. People who shared walls, shared meals, shared years of history. They aren't pointing fingers outward. They are pointing inward. And that's why their words are hitting so hard. Because they don't deny awareness. They deny understanding. There's a difference. They say they knew something was wrong, but not how wrong. They say they believed love, support, and discretion were enough. They say they feared what exposure would do, not just to one person, but to the entire family. And that fear shaped every decision that followed. Think about that for a second. Fear didn't just silence them. Fear organized them. According to what's now being said, there was an unspoken agreement. Never formal, never written, but clearly understood. Keep it inside the family. Handle it privately. Protect the name. Not because of malice, but because of panic. And here's where the contradictions begin. Because if you knew enough to hide it, didn't you know enough to intervene? That question is haunting this story, and no one has answered it cleanly yet. Romy Reiner's name comes up again and again when people talk about the moment everything began to unravel. She wasn't the loudest. She wasn't the most authoritative. But she was the one, according to reports, who finally said something couldn't stay buried. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens after years of internal conflict. Imagine living with a sense of unease you can't quite explain. Imagine watching someone you love spiral, not constantly, but unpredictably. Good days, bad days, then days that scare you. Do you tell yourself you're overreacting? Do you doubt your own instincts? That kind of psychological tug-of-war can paralyze people. And paralysis can look like complicity from the outside. That's the uncomfortable truth this story forces us to face. The family now says they were trapped between two impossible choices: expose someone they loved, or risk consequences they didn't fully understand. They chose silence, and now they're living with the aftermath of that choice. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because silence doesn't just protect, it isolates. It builds pressure. It allows narratives to form without correction. And once the silence breaks, it breaks violently. The public didn't hear whispers. They heard explosions, sudden arrests, severe charges, stunning allegations. And immediately, the question shifted from what happened to who knew. That question is merciless. It doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care about fear. It doesn't care about love. It only asks one thing: why didn't you stop it? Jake Reiner's decision to speak publicly didn't come with easy answers. Instead, it came with admissions that felt incomplete, almost evasive. He acknowledged awareness, but emphasized uncertainty. He spoke of concern, but also disbelief. And listeners noticed the gaps. What was left unsaid? What moments were skipped? What conversations happened behind closed doors? Every pause became suspicious. Every careful word became a potential tell. Tracy Reiner's silence, in contrast, has drawn just as much attention. Sometimes what people don't say tells you more than what they do. Her restraint, her hesitations, her reluctance to elaborate. Was it grief? Fear of legal consequences? Or something else entirely? No one knows for sure. And that uncertainty is fueling speculation faster than facts can keep up. Which brings us to the core of why this story matters now. Because it isn't just about what happened. It's about accountability. It's about whether protecting a family image can ever justify ignoring danger. It's about how easily love can turn into denial. And it's about how silence, even well-intentioned silence, can become devastating. If you're wondering why this story refuses to fade from public attention, that's why. It forces uncomfortable questions onto everyone watching. What would you have done? At what point does loyalty become negligence? At what point does fear stop being an excuse? And perhaps the hardest question of all, if you could go back, would you choose differently? According to those now speaking out, they ask themselves that every day. But reflection doesn't erase consequences. And breaking silence doesn't undo the past. It only exposes it. And this is just the beginning. Because as their statements continue, patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that suggest the truth wasn't just hidden, it was actively avoided. And once avoidance becomes habit, it's almost impossible to stop. But what comes next will challenge everything they've said so far. Because one revelation, buried beneath years of rationalizations, is about to surface. And when it does, it will force a single question none of them are ready to answer. Did they ignore the warning signs? Or did they knowingly look away? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the night that changed everything didn't feel dramatic at first? What if it felt ordinary? That's the part people struggle with the most. Because when we imagine turning points, we imagine thunder, sirens, a sudden, unmistakable shift in the air. But the people closest to this story say the night everything collapsed didn't announce itself that way at all. It crept in, quiet, heavy, almost polite. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop. Here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps resurfacing in every account, every statement, every whispered recollection. The family had lived with tension for so long that tension had started to feel normal. Ask yourself something honestly. How many warning signs does it take before your brain stops calling them warnings and starts calling them routine? That question sits at the heart of this chapter. Because according to those now speaking, the night itself wasn't the beginning. It was the final link in a chain that had been forming for years. Still, when that night arrived, no one expected it to end the way it did. It began like countless nights before it. Conversations unfinished. Emotions half-said. A house that carried history in its walls. Nothing about it screamed catastrophe. And that's what makes it so disturbing. Because when people talk about this case now, they want a single moment to point to. One argument. One explosion. One undeniable trigger. But the people who were there describe something else entirely. They describe a slow burn. A sense of unease that never fully left the room. The hours leading up to the collapse have been described as tense, but not chaotic. Uneasy, but not explosive. Familiar, in the worst possible way. There were no dramatic ultimatums. No slammed doors that everyone remembers. No final conversation where someone said, "This ends tonight." And maybe that's why no one intervened. Because it didn't feel urgent enough. Because urgency, after years of emotional strain, can start to blur. Time passes differently in families under pressure. Minutes stretch, years compress. Small incidents get absorbed into the background noise of daily life. And by the time something feels truly alarming, it has already crossed several invisible lines. This is where hindsight becomes brutal. Because now, every detail is being re-examined. Who said what? Who noticed what? Who chose not to push further? The night everything collapsed didn't begin with violence. It began with silence. Not the calm kind, the heavy kind. The kind where everyone senses something is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to name it. If you've ever lived in that kind of environment, you know exactly what that feels like. You monitor tone. You measure words. You avoid topics. You convince yourself that keeping the peace is the same as keeping people safe. According to those now reflecting back, that belief guided countless decisions, including the ones made that night. As the evening unfolded, nothing about it demanded outside intervention. No neighbors were alerted. No authorities were contacted. No emergency plans were activated. Because in that moment, it still felt like something that could be handled privately. Again, and again, and again. That pattern is impossible to ignore. The family had grown used to handling things internally, managing flare-ups, smoothing over conflict, reframing moments of concern as temporary setbacks. It wasn't denial in the dramatic sense. It was normalization. And normalization is far more dangerous. Because when something becomes normal, it stops triggering alarms. According to accounts that emerged later, there were moments during the night that felt off. Not enough to provoke panic. Just enough to register as discomfort. Tone shifts. Abrupt changes in mood. A sense that emotions were running hotter than words suggested. But no one stood up and said, "This stops now." No one made that call. Why? Because they had survived nights like this before. And that belief, that survival equaled safety, would prove devastating. As the hours passed, the house didn't erupt. It closed in. People retreated to separate spaces. Conversations ended without resolution. Tension lingered in the air, unresolved but familiar. And familiarity breeds complacency. That's another hard truth this chapter exposes. The people now speaking don't describe themselves as unaware. They describe themselves as tired. Tired of conflict. Tired of vigilance. Tired of feeling like every interaction could become something more. When exhaustion meets fear, decision-making deteriorates. You stop thinking in terms of prevention. You start thinking in terms of endurance. Just get through tonight. Just let things cool down. Just don't make it worse. Those thoughts repeat themselves in families under strain. And they repeated themselves that night. What's especially chilling is how ordinary some details sound when described after the fact. Lights turned off. Doors closed. Rooms went quiet. No dramatic farewell. No clear sense that this was the last normal moment. That's the part that haunts people the most. Because if the warning had been obvious, intervention would have been easier to justify. But when danger blends into routine, it becomes almost invisible. At some point in the night, according to later accounts, something shifted. Not externally, internally. The kind of shift you feel more than see. A tension that tightens rather than loosens. An emotional weight that doesn't dissipate with time. Still, no one acted. And that's where the public conversation turns unforgiving. People ask, how could they not know? But knowledge isn't binary. It exists in gradients. And those gradients can be blurred by love, fear, and habit. By the time the night crossed the line from tense to catastrophic, the opportunity for prevention had already passed. What followed wasn't a single moment. It was a sequence, a collapse rather than an explosion. When morning came, nothing about the house looked extraordinary from the outside. That's another detail that continues to disturb people. No signs of chaos visible from the street. No indication of the violence that had occurred inside. Just a quiet property holding a truth no one was prepared to confront. The discovery itself is described differently depending on who tells it. Some focus on the shock. Others focus on disbelief. Others still focus on the immediate realization that everything had changed forever. But all descriptions share one common element. The moment the truth became unavoidable. That's when the years of silence collapsed under their own weight. That's when every ignored warning sign re-emerged at once. That's when the question no one wanted to ask became impossible to avoid. How did it get this far? Romy's role in what happened next has become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire story. Not because she caused what happened, but because she became the voice that finally acknowledged what others had tried not to name. According to reports, she didn't speak in absolutes. She didn't present a clear villain. She presented concern, fear, recognition. And that alone changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Because once someone articulates danger out loud, silence can no longer pretend to be neutrality. Silence becomes a choice. And choices carry consequences. As authorities became involved, the family's carefully maintained internal world collided with external reality. Private decisions were now subject to public scrutiny. Years of rationalizations were suddenly being evaluated under a harsh, unforgiving lens. Every prior decision was reinterpreted. Every moment of restraint looked like omission. Every attempt at protection looked like concealment. This is where the story fractured into competing narratives. One narrative framed the family as victims of circumstance, trapped by fear and loyalty. Another framed them as enablers, unwilling to confront what they knew. And the truth, as it often does, sits somewhere deeply uncomfortable in between. Jake Reiner's later reflections on that night reveal a man wrestling with regret and defensiveness at the same time. He acknowledges things he wishes had been done differently, then hesitates, then retreats into uncertainty. That push and pull is visible in every statement. Tracy Reiner's absence from detailed commentary during this phase only intensified speculation. Was it grief holding her back, or fear of what honesty might unleash? No one outside the family can answer that definitively. And that uncertainty feeds the public's hunger for clarity. The problem is, clarity is rarely available in real time, especially when trauma is involved. As investigations progressed, the narrative hardened. What once felt ambiguous became framed as inevitable. But inevitability is often an illusion created after the fact. In the moment, people rarely feel like they are standing at the edge of disaster. They feel like they are standing in the middle of another difficult day. That's what makes this story resonate so deeply, because it forces a confrontation with a reality many people recognize but rarely discuss. That catastrophic outcomes are often built from ordinary decisions. From moments when doing nothing feels easier than doing something uncomfortable. From nights that feel survivable until they aren't. The night everything collapsed didn't end when the sun came up. It followed them, into statements, into interviews, into public judgment, and now into history. But here's the detail that shifts everything moving forward. Because as more information emerged, it became clear that this night wasn't the first time the family had confronted fear. It was simply the last time they avoided it. And what they avoided before would soon resurface in ways no one could control. Because buried beneath the shock of that night was something older, something unresolved, something that, if acknowledged earlier, might have changed the course of everything. And the next chapter begins exactly there, at the moment when the family image started to crack, long before anyone realized it was already breaking. But what happened before that night raises questions even more disturbing than what happened during it. And once those questions are asked, there's no turning back. What if the version of a family the world sees is the one they needed to believe in the most? Not the public, not the audience, the family itself. That question hangs over everything that follows. Because long before the night everything collapsed, there was an image, carefully maintained, quietly defended, rarely questioned. From the outside, the Reiner family looked steady, functional, resilient, the kind of family people point to as proof that success and stability can coexist. They appeared close. They appeared composed. They appeared in control. And appearances matter more than most people like to admit, especially when a name carries weight, especially when reputation becomes part of identity. Inside the home, according to those now speaking, reality was far more complicated. Not explosive, not constantly chaotic, just strained, a low-level tension that never fully disappeared. And that's important, because when people imagine hidden family turmoil, they imagine constant screaming, daily meltdowns, visible. You don't wake up one day and decide to ignore reality. You ease into it. one justification at a time, one rationalization at a time. According to those now reflecting back, the early signs didn't feel threatening enough to break the image. They felt inconvenient, disruptive, embarrassing even. And embarrassment is a powerful silencer. Because embarrassment threatens identity. It threatens the story you tell others, and yourself, about who you are. So instead of confronting uncomfortable truths, the family leaned into what they already knew how to do well. Function. Appear normal. Carry on. They hosted. They attended events. They laughed at dinners. And in between those moments, they managed what they believed were private issues. Handled internally, quietly, respectfully. That approach worked, until it didn't. What people are grappling with now is how long that balancing act lasted. Years. Years of managing contradictions. On one hand, a public-facing image of unity. On the other, private conversations filled with concern. They didn't live in denial. They lived in duality. And duality is exhausting, because it requires constant mental editing. You're always filtering, always adjusting, always asking yourself whether what you're seeing is real or whether you're overreacting. That uncertainty becomes a trap. And once you're trapped, every new incident gets measured against the past instead of evaluated on its own merits. People now say the family often explained away moments that, in hindsight, feel alarming. But hindsight is merciless. It strips away context. It flattens complexity. At the time, those moments were absorbed into an existing narrative. Stress, pressure, misunderstandings. Not danger. And here's where the image did real damage. Because maintaining an image requires consistency. You can't suddenly introduce chaos without explanation. You can't disrupt expectations without consequences. So instead of asking, "What is happening?" the family often asked, "How do we manage this?" That's a critical distinction. Managing implies control. Understanding requires vulnerability. Control feels safer, especially when the stakes feel high. The Reiner name wasn't just a family name. It was a symbol, a standard, a story others believed in. And once people believe in a story, dismantling it feels almost violent. So they chose preservation over disruption. Again and again, the internal conversations, according to later accounts, weren't about exposure. They were about containment. How do we keep this from escalating? How do we prevent embarrassment? How do we avoid overreaction? Notice what's missing from those questions. Urgency. The assumption was always that there would be time. Time to reassess later. Time to intervene if needed. Time to adjust. Time felt abundant. Until it wasn't. The family image didn't just influence how others saw them. It influenced how they saw themselves. They believed they were capable, responsible, reasonable. People like that don't let things spiral, right? That belief can become blinding. Because when something threatens it, the instinct isn't to reevaluate, it's to defend. Defend the identity. Defend the narrative. Defend the image. That defense mechanism showed up in subtle ways. In minimized language. In softened descriptions. In delayed decisions. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to keep things appearing stable. And stability, once achieved, becomes addictive. Because instability is frightening. Especially when you don't know how far it could go. The family learned to coexist with discomfort. They didn't ignore it. They compartmentalized it. That distinction matters. Compartmentalization allows people to function while avoiding emotional overload. But it also prevents holistic understanding. You see pieces, not patterns. And patterns are where danger often reveals itself. As time passed, the gap between image and reality widened. But because it widened gradually, it went largely unnoticed. Like a crack forming slowly in a wall. You don't see it grow. You just notice one day that it's there. And by then, it's structural. According to those now speaking, there were moments when the image almost cracked. Moments of heightened concern. Moments when someone suggested taking things more seriously. But those moments were often followed by relief. A calmer period. A return to normalcy. And that return reinforced the belief that intervention wasn't necessary. See, it passed. That cycle repeated. Concern, relief, rationalization. Over and over. This is how people convince themselves they're doing the right thing. Not through grand declarations. Through repetition. Each time nothing terrible happens, a decision to stay quiet feels validated. Until the day it isn't. The public has struggled to understand this dynamic because it clashes with how we like our narratives. We prefer clear villains, clear negligence, clear moments of failure. But this story resists that simplicity. It exists in the gray, which is why it's so unsettling. Because gray areas implicate everyone. If the family image had been false, exposure would have been easier. But the image wasn't false. It was incomplete. And incomplete truths are harder to dismantle than outright lies. Jake Reiner's later comments hint at this internal struggle. He speaks of responsibility, but also of context, of knowing something wasn't right, but not believing it was catastrophic. That tension shows up repeatedly. It's not that he denies awareness. It's that he resists the idea that awareness equaled certainty. And certainty is what people want now. Certainty makes judgment easy. Tracy Reiner's limited engagement during this phase adds another layer of complexity. Silence can mean many things. Shock, grief, legal caution, or something else entirely. Without clarity, people fill the gaps themselves. And speculation thrives in silence. Romy Reiner's perspective, when it emerges, feels different. Less guarded, more conflicted. She doesn't frame the past as manageable. She frames it as troubling. That contrast matters, because it suggests not everyone experienced the image the same way, which raises another uncomfortable question. Whose version of reality did the family prioritize? And why? Family dynamics are rarely equal. Power shifts. Voices carry different weight. Concerns expressed by some may be dismissed by others, not out of malice, but hierarchy, experience, authority, age. When those dynamics are present, the image tends to reflect the perspective of those with the most influence, not necessarily those with the most fear. And fear often speaks quietly, especially when it feels unsupported. As this chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that the family image didn't just obscure reality from the outside. It distorted it on the inside. By maintaining composure publicly, they convinced themselves they were managing privately. But management isn't the same as resolution. And unresolved tension doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Eventually, it demands attention. The moment the image began to crack wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, a realization, a shift in perception, a growing sense that what they were calling normal wasn't. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. And those fragments will become critical as the story moves forward. Because once someone starts seeing the gap between image and reality, they can't unsee it. And once one person sees it, others often follow. The family image, once protective, began to feel suffocating. Maintaining it required too much effort, too much silence, too much emotional compromise. And cracks don't stay small forever. They spread, quietly, relentlessly. And the next chapter begins at the exact moment when those cracks could no longer be ignored. Because before the night everything collapsed, there was something else. A series of signs that didn't fit the image anymore. Signs that forced a reckoning. And when those signs appeared, the family faced a decision they could no longer postpone. But instead of clarity, they found contradiction. And contradiction would become the most dangerous force of all. What if the first warning signs didn't feel like warnings at all? What if they felt like noise? That question sits at the center of this chapter. Because according to those now speaking, the earliest signs weren't dramatic enough to trigger alarm. But they were persistent enough to change the atmosphere of the home. And persistence has a way of eroding certainty. The family didn't wake up one morning and say, something is seriously wrong. They noticed shifts. Subtle ones. The kind you talk yourself out of. A change in tone during conversations. An edge where there used to be patience. Moments of intensity that arrived suddenly and disappeared just as fast. At first, these things were easy to explain. Stress, pressure, fatigue. Life gets hard. People react differently. That's what they told themselves. And maybe, at the beginning, that explanation was reasonable. But here's where the pattern starts to matter. Because the signs didn't come once. They came again, and again, not in the same way every time, which made them harder to pin down. One day it was irritability. Another day it was withdrawal. Another day it was an outburst that felt disproportionate to the moment. None of it lasted long enough to force a reckoning. Everything eventually cooled down. And that cool down became proof, at least in their minds, that things were under control. Have you ever noticed how easily people confuse resolution with relief? Relief just means the tension has eased. Resolution means the cause has been addressed. The family leaned heavily on relief. Every time things calmed down, it felt like a confirmation that intervention wasn't necessary. But calm can be deceptive, especially when it follows volatility. The early signs were described later as unsettling, but not frightening. That distinction matters. Unsettling makes you uncomfortable. Frightening makes you act. They weren't frightened yet. They were uneasy. And unease is easier to live with. You can normalize unease. You can incorporate it into daily routines. You can convince yourself it's temporary. Fear demands change. Unease asks for patience. So they chose patience. One of the earliest red flags people now point to is how unpredictable moods became. Not constant anger. Not constant sadness. Inconsistency. That's harder to interpret, because inconsistency allows hope. If someone has bad days and good days, you assume the good days are the real ones. You tell yourself the bad days are anomalies, exceptions, not indicators. The family focused on the good days. They leaned into them, used them as evidence that concerns were exaggerated. And that focus shaped every decision that followed. There were moments when conversations turned sharper than expected. Words landed harder. Silences stretched longer. But those moments were rarely addressed directly. Instead, they were smoothed over. Apologies were offered. Explanations were accepted. The household returned to baseline. That cycle repeated. And repetition breeds tolerance. Tolerance blunts urgency. Over time, what once would have stood out began to fade into the background. This is where people watching from the outside struggle to relate. They ask why no one sounded the alarm, why no one forced intervention. But alarms are only triggered when something crosses a threshold. And thresholds are subjective. They shift depending on context, depending on history, depending on how much you want to believe things will improve. The family wanted to believe improvement was inevitable, because believing otherwise meant confronting a reality they didn't feel equipped to handle. As the signs accumulated, they became harder to ignore, but also harder to interpret. Some moments suggested vulnerability. Others suggested anger. Others suggested detachment. There was no single, consistent narrative. And without consistency, certainty feels unreachable. The family found themselves constantly recalibrating. Is this getting worse? Or is this just another fluctuation? That question followed them for years. And each time it went unanswered, it reinforced inertia. One particularly telling detail that has surfaced involves how concerns were framed internally. They weren't framed as danger. They were framed as challenges. Challenges imply solvability. They imply effort. They imply time. Danger implies urgency. Danger implies external help. The language matters, because language shapes response. By choosing softer words, the family softened the reality they were confronting, not consciously, instinctively, because harsh language felt destabilizing, and stability was the goal. At some point, the signs began to escalate in intensity, not frequency. That's another important distinction. It wasn't that things happened more often. It was that when they did happen, they felt heavier, more charged, harder to dismiss. That's when discomfort started edging toward fear. But fear still didn't fully take hold. Why? Because every escalation was followed by a return to calm. And calm has a powerful effect on memory. It makes people doubt their own reactions. It makes yesterday's fear feel exaggerated. That self-doubt is paralyzing. Because if you don't trust your own perception, you hesitate to act. You seek reassurance. You look to others for confirmation. And if others also hesitate, inaction becomes the default. This is where group dynamics play a crucial role. Concern expressed by one person may be dismissed by another, not because it's wrong, but because acknowledging it would force action, and action carries consequences. So concern gets reframed, minimized, deferred. There were moments when someone suggested taking things more seriously. Those moments didn't lead to immediate dismissal. They led to discussion. Discussion led to compromise. Compromise led to delay. Delay led to normalization. And normalization led right back to silence. That cycle is difficult to break once it's established, because breaking it requires someone to disrupt the equilibrium, to say, this isn't okay anymore. And that's a terrifying position to occupy within a family. It risks conflict. It risks blame. It risks being wrong. No one wants to be the person who overreacted, especially when the cost of being wrong feels high. So instead, they waited for certainty. And certainty never arrived, because certainty rarely announces itself in advance. It reveals itself afterward. As time went on, the signs began to feel less like isolated incidents and more like a pattern. But patterns are only obvious when viewed as a whole. And people living inside them don't get that vantage point. They see moments, not trajectories. One moment doesn't demand intervention. A trajectory does. But recognizing a trajectory requires stepping back. And stepping back requires emotional distance. Distance the family didn't have. Because this wasn't an abstract situation. It was personal. Deeply personal. Love complicates judgment. It biases perception. It pushes people toward optimism even when evidence suggests caution. And optimism can be dangerous when it delays necessary action. At some point, concern became shared. More than one person noticed the same shifts, the same tensions, the same unpredictability. That should have been a turning point. But instead of prompting decisive action, it prompted collective reassurance. If everyone saw it, then everyone could manage it. That's how the thinking went. Shared awareness became shared responsibility. And shared responsibility often becomes diluted responsibility. When everyone is responsible, no one feels fully accountable. This is where hindsight turns sharp again. Because now, those early signs look unmistakable. They look like warnings that should have been impossible to miss. But at the time, they were layered beneath context. History, hope, denial. The family wasn't blind. They were conflicted. They wanted to protect someone they loved. They wanted to protect themselves. They wanted to protect a future they still believed in. And that belief kept them from confronting the present. The first signs they say they ignored weren't ignored in the way people imagine. They were acknowledged, discussed, then set aside, over and over. And that repetition created a false sense of control. We're aware. We're monitoring. We'll step in if it gets worse. But worse is a moving target. It shifts as people adapt. What felt unacceptable at first becomes tolerable later. That's how lines blur. That's how boundaries erode. And that erosion often goes unnoticed until it's complete. By the time the family realized the signs weren't passing, the situation had already evolved. The stakes had changed, but their approach hadn't. They were still relying on patience, on internal management, on silence. And silence, once again, felt easier than confrontation, until it didn't. Because eventually, the signs crossed from unsettling to alarming. And when that happened, the family faced a moment of reckoning they had been postponing for years. A moment when inaction was no longer neutral. A moment when doing nothing became a decision in itself. But instead of clarity, that moment brought contradiction. Different interpretations, different fears, different thresholds. And those differences would fracture the sense of unity the family depended on. Because when people disagree about danger, they also disagree about responsibility. And responsibility was about to become the most contested concept of all. The next chapter begins at the exact point where those early signs stopped being debatable, when concern hardened into fear. And fear demanded answers. But the answers they found would raise even more questions. And one of those questions would change everything. Because once the early signs hardened into fear, the family didn't move toward exposure. They moved toward control. They told themselves they could handle it. That phrase sounds responsible on the surface. Calm, measured, adult. But underneath it hides something far more fragile. Confidence without certainty. When people say, "We can handle this," what they often mean is, "We don't know what else to do." And admitting that feels like failure. The fear had changed by this point. It was no longer abstract, no longer hypothetical. It had shape, weight, memory, moments that lingered longer than before. Moments that didn't resolve as cleanly. Moments that left people shaken even after calm returned. That's when internal conversations shifted, not toward outside help, toward strategy. How do we manage this better? How do we prevent escalation? How do we keep things from spilling out? Notice the focus. Prevention of visibility, not prevention of harm. That doesn't make them malicious. It makes them human, because visibility felt like danger. Exposure felt irreversible. Once something is acknowledged publicly, it can't be unacknowledged. And the family feared losing control more than they feared what silence might cost. That fear shaped everything. They began to structure interactions differently. Conversations became more careful. Topics were chosen deliberately. Triggers were avoided when possible. The household adapted. Adaptation can look like responsibility, but adaptation can also look like accommodation. And accommodation, when it involves fear. As the belief that they could handle it took hold, it became self-reinforcing. Each time they navigated a difficult moment without catastrophe, it strengthened their confidence. See, we managed that. Each time they avoided an escalation, it felt like success. But success was defined narrowly. Success meant nothing visibly terrible happened. It didn't mean the underlying issue was addressed. It meant the surface stayed intact. And surfaces are deceptively reassuring. The family began to operate under an unspoken rule. Intervention was only necessary if things crossed a line. The problem? No one could agree on where that line was. For some, the line had already been crossed. For others, it hadn't. That disagreement created tension, but not enough to break the consensus that they could still handle it internally. So compromise filled the gap. And compromise, in this context, meant delay. Let's wait and see. Let's give it time. Let's not overreact. Overreaction became the fear that governed action. Not danger, not harm. Overreaction. Because overreaction would force exposure. It would invite scrutiny. It would collapse the image they had worked so hard to maintain. An image, once again, felt essential. Not because they were obsessed with appearances, but because appearances had become a stabilizing force. As long as things looked normal, they could pretend they were. That belief extended into how they interpreted behavior. Moments that might have once triggered concern were now reframed through a lens of familiarity. We've seen this before. It always passes. This isn't new. Familiarity dulls fear. And fear dulled is easier to ignore. The phrase, "we thought we could handle it," carries another implication. It suggests effort. And effort can feel like action. They weren't doing nothing. They were watching, monitoring, adjusting. But watching isn't the same as intervening. Monitoring isn't the same as addressing. An adjustment often means bending rather than fixing. The family began to carry an invisible burden. Constant vigilance. It's exhausting. It drains emotional reserves. It creates resentment, even when people don't want to admit it. Resentment adds another layer of complexity. Because resentment creates silence of its own. People stop expressing concerns because they're tired of feeling like the only ones worried. They stop pushing because pushing hasn't worked before. They withdraw. And withdrawal reduces the flow of information, which increases risk. This is where internal contradictions deepened. They believed they were protecting everyone, but protection was uneven. Some people felt safer because they were in control. Others felt less safe because they had no voice. Those dynamics matter. Because when power is uneven, reality gets filtered. Concerns raised by some carry more weight than concerns raised by others. And when the belief that we can handle it dominates, dissent feels disruptive. So dissent is softened, or postponed, or ignored, not intentionally, but effectively. The family didn't sit down and agree to hide the truth. They agreed to manage it. Management implies oversight. It implies competence. It implies responsibility. But management without external perspective often becomes containment. And containment traps everyone inside. As time passed, the cost of this approach increased. Emotionally, psychologically, every moment of calm required more effort to maintain. Every flare-up required more calculation. The margin for error shrank, but the family didn't perceive it shrinking. They were too close to it. Like standing inside a room while the walls slowly move inward. You don't notice the shift until there's no space left. The belief that they could handle it also affected how they spoke to each other. Honesty became selective, not because they wanted to deceive, because they wanted to prevent reactions. Conversations were edited in real time. What do I say? What do I hold back? What's worth risking conflict over? That constant self-censorship erodes trust. Not immediately, gradually. People begin to feel unseen, unheard. And when people feel that way, they stop sharing information that might be crucial. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this chapter, because it shows how good intentions can produce harmful outcomes. No one was trying to cause harm. They were trying to avoid it. But avoidance isn't prevention. It's postponement. And postponed problems don't disappear. They grow. One detail that emerges repeatedly in reflections on this period is the sense of isolation. Despite being surrounded by family, individuals felt alone with their fears. They didn't want to burden others. They didn't want to escalate tension, so they carried concern quietly. That isolation is dangerous. Because isolated fear has nowhere to go. It doesn't get challenged. It doesn't get contextualized. It just sits. And sitting fear can turn into dread. The belief that they could handle it also delayed the involvement of people who might have offered perspective, outside voices, professional insight, objective assessment. Those options existed, but they felt like admissions of failure. And failure felt unacceptable, especially when so much had already been invested in maintaining control. This is where sunk cost comes into play. The longer you manage something internally, the harder it becomes to stop. Because stopping means admitting the approach didn't work. And that admission can feel devastating. So instead, people double down. They refine the strategy. They try harder. They tell themselves that if they just adjust one more thing, it will stabilize. That's what happened here. Adjustments multiplied. Boundaries shifted. Expectations changed. And all of it was framed as handling the situation responsibly, until the emotional cost became undeniable. Fatigue set in. Patience wore thin. Confidence wavered. But the belief remained. We can handle this. We have to. Because the alternative was too frightening to face. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because the belief in handling it wasn't shared equally, some began to question it. Some began to feel it was no longer true. Those doubts didn't surface all at once. They surfaced as discomfort, as hesitation, as a growing sense that something was being missed. And when belief systems fracture, conflict follows. Not loud conflict. Internal conflict. Private conflict. The kind that simmers. Romy's perspective during this period begins to diverge. She doesn't describe confidence. She describes anxiety. She doesn't describe management. She describes fear. That difference matters. Because it suggests the belief in handling it wasn't universal. It was dominant. And dominance can silence minority concerns. Not through force. Through inertia. The family continued forward. Handling. Managing. Containing. Until one moment shattered the illusion that containment equaled control. A moment when the familiar strategies failed. When calm didn't return. When relief didn't arrive. That moment didn't come with a warning label. It arrived the same way everything else had. Quietly. And by the time they realized the belief had been wrong, the consequences were already unfolding. The next chapter begins exactly there. At the point when handling turned into helplessness. When confidence collapsed. And when the family realized that believing they could handle it may have been the most dangerous mistake of all. Because once that belief broke, there was no replacement ready. Only panic. Only regret. Only the terrifying question they had avoided for years. What if we were never in control at all? What if silence wasn't accidental? What if it was chosen? Not in a dramatic meeting. Not with signatures or promises. But slowly, quietly, collectively. That's the uncomfortable territory this chapter enters. Because after the belief that they could handle it began to fracture, something else took its place. An understanding. Unspoken, but powerful. We don't talk about this. Not outside these walls. Not to people who wouldn't understand. Not to anyone who might take control away from us. Silence became policy. Not written, not enforced, but expected. And expectations can be stronger than rules. At first, silence felt temporary. Just until things stabilized. Just until emotions cooled. Just until clarity arrived. But clarity never came. So silence stayed. This is where many people watching from the outside draw a hard line. They imagine silence as deception, as intentional cover-up. But inside families, silence often masquerades as protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of dignity. Protection of people you love. The problem is that protection doesn't come with an expiration date. And without one, it becomes permanent. The pact of silence didn't begin as a conspiracy. It began as relief. Relief that no one was forcing a decision yet. Relief that nothing had been exposed. Relief that the family still controlled the narrative. That relief was addictive. Because control feels like safety, especially when the alternative feels chaotic. The family learned quickly that speaking openly created tension. Questions multiplied. Disagreements surfaced. Anxiety spiked. Silence smoothed things over. Silence restored calm. Silence reduced conflict. So silence was rewarded. Not consciously. Emotionally. Every time someone chose not to say something, the immediate outcome was easier. No argument. No confrontation. No escalation. That feedback loop reinforced itself. Speak up, and things get messy. Stay quiet, and things stay manageable. Manageable became the goal. Not resolution. not truth. Manageable. Over time, the silence became normalized. It stopped feeling like a choice. It started feeling like reality. Certain topics simply disappeared from conversation, not because they weren't important, but because they were too dangerous to touch. When something is too dangerous to discuss, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. It shows up in tension, in guarded behavior, in emotional distance. The family didn't become closer through silence. They became more careful. Careful with words. Careful with tone. Careful with each other. That carefulness was exhausting. And exhaustion breeds mistakes. One of the most striking things about the pact of silence is how it varied from person to person. Not everyone understood it the same way. For some, silence meant discretion. For others, it meant denial. For others still, it felt like betrayal. Those differences created invisible fault lines within the family. Fault lines that would eventually rupture. Jake Reiner's reflections suggest a belief that silence was necessary. Necessary to prevent panic. Necessary to avoid misinterpretation. Necessary to protect people from consequences he feared would be irreversible. He doesn't describe silence as comfort. He describes it as strategy. But strategies require constant adjustment. And without transparency, strategies become guesswork. Tracy Reiner's position within this silence is harder to read. Her restraint appears deliberate, but restraint can mean many things. Fear, calculation, or a deeper conflict between loyalty and conscience. Without explicit explanation, people fill the gaps themselves. And silence invites interpretation. Romy Reiner's experience of the pact feels markedly different. She doesn't describe silence as protective. She describes it as isolating. She doesn't describe relief. She describes pressure. Pressure to comply. Pressure to minimize. Pressure to stay quiet, even when staying quiet felt wrong. That difference matters. Because it suggests the pact wasn't equally embraced. It was unevenly borne. And uneven burdens breed resentment. Resentment rarely announces itself. It simmers. It manifests as withdrawal, as emotional distance, as a sense of being unheard. Those undercurrents shaped the family dynamic in ways no one fully acknowledged at the time. The pact of silence also altered how information flowed. Concerns were filtered, details were softened, language became vague. That vagueness wasn't accidental. It was a coping mechanism. Specifics make things real. Vagueness keeps them abstract. And abstraction feels safer. But abstraction is dangerous because it prevents people from grasping the full scope of a problem. They see fragments, not the whole. As silence deepened, the family began to live with two parallel realities, one public, one private, and maintaining two realities requires constant mental effort. You have to remember who knows what, who can be told which version, what's safe to share, what must stay hidden. That mental load increases stress. Stress impairs judgment, and impaired judgment increases risk. This is where the pact of silence starts to show its true cost. Not externally, internally. It eroded trust. Not because people stopped caring, but because honesty felt dangerous. When honesty feels dangerous, relationships become transactional. You weigh every word. You anticipate reactions. You adjust truth to preserve peace. Over time, people stop feeling fully known. And when people don't feel known, they stop sharing. That withdrawal limits visibility. And limited visibility allows problems to grow unchecked. The silence also delayed outside intervention, not just professional help. Emotional support, perspective, validation. Without those inputs, the family relied solely on their own interpretations. And interpretations, when unchallenged, can drift. They drifted toward optimism, toward normalization, toward minimizing risk, because acknowledging risk would have shattered the silence. And shattering the silence felt like opening a door they couldn't close. There were moments when the pact almost broke. Moments when someone spoke more openly than intended. Moments when fear leaked through carefully controlled language. Those moments were often followed by retreat, a return to silence, an unspoken reminder that certain lines shouldn't be crossed. Those reminders didn't come as commands. They came as looks, as pauses, as changes in tone, subtle signals that carried weight. That subtlety made the pact more powerful. Because it wasn't imposed, it was absorbed. The family didn't sit down and agree to hide the truth from the world. They agreed to protect each other. And protection, in this context, meant silence. But protection has consequences, especially when it shields behavior rather than addressing it. The longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to break. Because breaking it meant admitting that staying silent had been wrong. It meant confronting guilt, regret, responsibility. Those are heavy burdens, heavier than silence. So silence endured, until it didn't. One detail that emerges later is how the pact affected Romy's sense of agency. She describes feeling trapped, not physically, emotionally. She knew things. She felt things, but she didn't feel empowered to act on them. That dissonance created intense internal conflict. Conflict that didn't resolve. It accumulated. And accumulation leads to rupture. The pact of silence wasn't sustainable. It relied on constant cooperation, constant suppression, constant alignment. And alignment breaks when people experience fear differently. Romy's fear intensified. Jake's fear focused on exposure. Tracy's fear remains harder to categorize. But fear drove them in different directions. Those diverging fears pulled at the pact from within. Cracks formed, small at first, then wider. The silence began to feel less like protection and more like pressure. Pressure to pretend, pressure to comply, pressure to ignore instincts. Instincts don't disappear when ignored. They get louder. Eventually, someone breaks. Not because they want to, because they can't hold it anymore. That breaking point didn't come with a warning. It arrived quietly, in a moment of realization. A realization that silence was no longer neutral. It was actively harmful. That realization changed everything. Because once someone sees silence as harm, they can't participate in it anymore. And when one person stops participating, the pact begins to unravel. The unraveling didn't happen publicly at first. It happened internally, in shifts of behavior, in changes of tone, in hesitation where there had once been compliance. The family sensed it. They felt the balance change. They knew something was different, but they didn't yet understand how far-reaching the consequences would be. Because once the pact of silence breaks inside a family, it rarely breaks cleanly. It fractures, and fractures create chaos. The next chapter begins at the moment when silence gave way to something far more dangerous. Speech. Not measured speech, not controlled speech, but emotional, unfiltered truth. And once that truth emerged, it set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Because silence can be restored. But once the truth is spoken, it has momentum. And that momentum was about to collide with reality in ways the family never anticipated. What happens when silence stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like betrayal? That's the question that defines this chapter. Because while the pact of silence held the family together on the surface, it was slowly tearing Romy apart on the inside. Her breaking point didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, day by day, moment by moment, thought by thought. And the most dangerous part? No one around her saw it coming. From the outside, Romy appeared composed. Quiet, yes. Reserved, maybe. But not unstable. That assumption would prove costly. Because breaking points rarely look dramatic before they happen. They look like endurance. Romy had been carrying a weight no one fully understood. Not because she never expressed concern, but because every time she did, it was absorbed into the existing system of silence. Softened, reframed, deferred. She learned quickly what happened when she pushed too hard. Tension rose. Defensiveness followed. The conversation stalled. So she adjusted. She learned to say less. To choose her moments carefully. To watch reactions before finishing sentences. That kind of self-editing changes a person. It teaches them that truth is conditional. That honesty has consequences. And that silence is sometimes safer than being seen as disruptive. But safety is not the same as peace. And Romy was not at peace. Internally, her fear had a different quality than the others. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It was visceral. She didn't just feel concern. She felt unease in her body, a tightening in her chest, a sense of alertness she couldn't turn off, a feeling that something was wrong even when nothing obvious was happening. That kind of intuition is difficult to articulate, especially in an environment that rewards calm. Romy struggled to put words to what she felt, not because she lacked insight, but because language failed her. How do you explain a fear that doesn't have a single cause? How do you convince others when you can't point to one definitive moment? She tried, in subtle ways. Questions, hesitations, carefully phrased concerns. But subtlety is easy to dismiss, and dismissal teaches silence. As time passed, Romy began to feel increasingly alone with her fear. Not abandoned, just unheard. And being unheard can be more isolating than being alone, because it makes you doubt yourself. She wondered if she was overreacting, if her perspective was skewed, if her